Chapter 58, Transportation, Section 7. It was the policy of the local government to relieve the Crown from that class of prisoners who were incapable of useful labour on the public works. The settlers from Norfolk Island, who had acquired their liberty or fulfilled their military service, became the employers of prisoners. Many of the masters, in their principles and habits, did not differ from their men. Frequently, their accomplices and sharers of their spoil. Those engaged in the interior, intending the flocks and herds, were often paid in proportion to the increase, and beside the property of their masters, they had charge of their own. This system, fraught with mischief, continued for many years, in spite of the interdicts of the government and the fatal results exhibited in the courts of justice. Cattle and sheep stealing were carried to an astonishing extent. The owners, ignorant sometimes of the amount of their wealth, confided its safety to men incapable of resisting ordinary temptation. The more opulent estimated their annual loss at 1/5 of the increase, and in unfavourable situations where many cotters were established, they found the preservation of their stock impossible and relinquished the attempt in despair. The brand was obliterated, often with great ingenuity. The I became H, C was turned into G, and P into B. The more daring blotted out all brands by a heated shovel. Stockyards were enclosed and hidden by the bush, where cattle were slaughtered, and sheep by scores were salted down. Ewes were driven into the interior until their lambs were weaned, when they were returned to their owners. In supplying the commissariat, it was not unusual to drive a flock of sheep for inspection, which were again returned to the fold, and others from a stolen stock passed under the certificate thus obtained, and the plunder of the royal herds was slaughtered and sold to the Crown. Such depredations were enormous, large gangs were in combination, and the first session held in Van Diemen's Land brought to light extensive robberies, comprehending 1,200 sheep. These evils were encouraged by difficulties in the administration of justice. For 5 years, 15 charges only were tried by the Court of Criminal Jurisdiction in New South Wales. The prosecutor, the witnesses, and the prisoners were forwarded together. On one occasion, 6 were sent up for trial. The skins of the stolen beasts were deposited in a cask, and the proof was deemed complete. But of the same cooperage, another was prepared, an admirable imitation. This last was opened in court, but it was found filled with the skins of seals, and, by the ingenious transformation, the prosecution was satisfied. It is just to observe that the absence of legal redress not only prompted but extenuated these violations of law. Crime retaliated crime. The lower settlers carried on a system of plunder, but the uncertain tenure of property weakened that moral principle which is its surest defence. The cattle stealer was himself a loser by the man he robbed. A stray beast was branded without question. The owner, when he discovered that his property was beyond his reach, except by the prosecution of the robber, adopted a shorter course. Reprisals thus lost half their guilt, nor is it wonderful that such feelings, as borderers were said once to cherish, prevailed among men who found excuses in their position, and indemnified their past or possible losses by the first spoil which came in their way. But these combinations led to other crimes. The robbers had their accomplices and abettors. The theft complete, they grew suspicious of each other, and some who disappeared were sacrificed by the jealousy of their companions. When engaged in these depredations, they usually set a watch. A cautious traveller avoided inquiry, and well-authenticated instances proved how perilous, in those days of violence, was an expression of curiosity or suspicion. To stop these plundering habits, the King's Commissioner Bigg advised a periodical sitting of the court in Van Diemen's Land. In 1821, Judge Wild visited this country, and for various crimes, 25 persons were condemned to death, of whom 10 were executed. 116 persons were incarcerated prior to his arrival, a large proportion compared with the census, 7,372. But 2 years after, the number charged with similar offences proved that crime was not abated. Among those who suffered death was George Richardson. His case illustrated the process by which such felonies were perpetuated. Formerly the confidential servant of Colonel Davy, he was employed by Dr. Scott and had charge of his flock, himself being an owner of stock. Having received an order to supply Dr. Spence a quantity of sheep, He deliberately separated them from a neighbour's flock and drove them to their destination with the coolness proper to an ordinary transaction. The proof of guilt was too clear to be affected by artifice, though calculated to elude suspicion by its very deliberation. Nor is it difficult, when examining the criminal records of those times, to suppose that the trepidation natural when violating the law was overcome by the indifference of habit. Few of the higher classes, it may be presumed, connived at these nefarious transactions. One memorable instance proved that no class is absolutely safe in an atmosphere of guilt. A settler, connected with a Scottish family of great respectability, thus forfeited his life. It was stated that his robberies were incessant and that he leagued with bushrangers, to whom, perhaps constrained by fear, he gave notice of danger by signals. A secluded sheep-yard was discovered, and a large sheep brand, of a remarkable shape. At a distance, 400 sheep were found, bearing the mark newly made, which was contrived to obliterate the brand of Mr. Jones, the owner. The culprit had prepared this flock to transfer to another person, to whom a number were due. It was in vain that witnesses testified to his character and to the respectability of his house. The jury pronounced him guilty, and he was executed. A friend who accompanied him to the scaffold heard him say that that moment was the most happy of his life. It doubtless brought deliverance. He left behind an infant family, the last, of whom was born while the father was in prison, and an aged parent in Scotland, who, long after he was dead, indulged her maternal tenderness by preparing clothing for his use and hoping for tidings of his prosperity. His name is suppressed, lest even now the record of his fate might meet the eye of a mourner. Society, as it then existed, nourished every species of crime. Tattered promissory notes of small amount and doubtful parentage fluttered about the colony. Dumps struck out from dollars were imitated by a coin prepared without requiring much mechanical ingenuity, and plate, stolen by bushrangers and burglars, was melted down and disposed of in a similar form. Nothing was neglected. They burnt the implements of husbandry for the iron. They robbed the gibbet of the chains. They even wrenched the plate from the coffin of an opulent merchant and stripped him of his shroud. In looking at the origin of the population and the various inducements continually offered to the perpetration of wickedness, the total dissolution of manners is no subject of surprise. It was perhaps but a small aggravation that prostitution and concubinage were held too venial for remark. Many of the officers of government made no secret of their relation to the women whom they adopted as mistresses and sometimes respected as wives. Among the anomalies of the day was the release of such females from compulsory attendance on divine worship, on account of the official preference they enjoyed, a curious immunity from a penal obligation, to be taken perhaps as a sinister acknowledgment that the government was not insensible to virtue, as the Russian courtesan extinguishes the candle of ceremony and veils her patron saint. Sorel, on his accession to the government, attempted to reform the more flagrant abuses by which he was surrounded. He was aided in his task by Mr. Humphrey, a man superior, by education and habit, to many charged with similar duties. He established an exact register of the conviction, arrival, and distribution of the prisoners, and appointed times for the muster of such as were assigned. He imposed some restrictions on their wandering habits and required that those who employed them should answer for their residence. It was the custom, however, to allow the greater part to reside in lodgings provided by themselves. They thus spent their leisure time where they were exposed to perpetual temptation, and nightly robberies attested their diligence. The traders of Hobart Town, for several years, were compelled to sleep on their counters and watch their property with the most scrupulous care. An inquiry who had been pillaged became the ordinary morning salutation. The thieves broke through the walls with oriental skill. A stormy night afforded them a harvest. During a tempest of extraordinary severity, which deluged the streets and carried away fences, they contrived to pillage to a great amount. A ladder was discovered at a window, constructed for the purpose, by which they ascended to the upper chamber, and thus proved that no elevation was safe. Nor did they confine their ravages to the towns. They entered the store of a settler and stripped his dwelling of £40 worth of goods, which they conveyed by boat to Hobart Town. Many were living without any lawful means of subsistence, and as their numbers increased, fraud and robbery were perpetrated in every house and at every hour of the day. Such was the state of the colony at the close of Sorel's administration, who found that without the means of nightly restraint, all regulations of police were in vain. On resigning office, he predicted the difficulties of his successor and warned him that he must expect to contend with increasing crime. To estimate the merit of Arthur's government, it is necessary to remember those evils. With what difficulty authority, long relaxed, is recovered, even by the most skillful and vigorous hands. When a few years had elapsed, the security of the colony was a subject of universal astonishment, and it was boasted that men slept with their doors unlocked and their windows unfastened, and often with property to a large amount strewed around their dwellings, notwithstanding a dangerous temerity. By what means these results were, even partially attained, the reader will be curious to know. End of chapter 58, being transportation. Section 7.